Hey everybody, welcome back to our weekly podcast. My name is Patrick Tan. I'm the General Counsel for ChainArgos. With me, as usual, every week, our CEO and Chief Data Scientist, Jonathan Reiter. It's a big day for you, John. You just got your paper published in Nature.
Okay, not that big.
But
It's not Nature. It's anyway.
well, it says Nature on
Okay,
the URL, so I'm just
that.
gonna go with what.
Don't
Anyway,
do that.
this week, what we're gonna talk about, EtherFi airdrop updates and some interesting data points as to how you could really interpret some of this data. Compliance Impossibility, where we will talk about John's paper that was published in the URL that says nature.com.
It's not just mine, and it's a different journal with the
Anyway,
same website.
yeah, we're not interested. Armstrong, Brian Armstrong of Coinbase's his USDT comments, his Tether comments, and the Circle's acquisition of Hashnote, which is interesting ramifications, if you will, for a variety of products that actually use USYC, which is Hashnote's product, as a backing asset for their stable coins and what have you. So quite a bit to unpack today. Let's just jump straight in. EtherFi's airdrop updates. Now, we've spoken about EtherFi before in terms of like how they manage their wallets and their liquidity and stuff like that, and where, like, you know, there was stuff basically, and you can see this case study on our website as well, but there's like you know, pockets of tokens in wallets which have not been labeled by the team as belonging to for certain functions, and they're not like locked contractually in any way. They're just like multi-sigs in some cases.
Yeah, there were a whole bunch of strange. So it's an old podcast.
That's an old podcast stuff.
I read,
but we're not talking about that today. We're talking about
we're
airdrops.
going to start with this, and then we're going to look at some of the airdrop dynamics. So this is a wallet that we'd previously identified as holding
A bunch of
tokens that were kind of an unexplained thing, and the whole point here is just to show this is a balance over time, and then you've got these little jagged numbers we'll come to in a second. These are showing numbers of inflows and outflows, average counts, amounts, that kind of stuff. And you know, you can tell here that this is a declining balance, and it's cleared out by now. It's quite low. It's still dropping 156. Okay, but that whatever that thing was that was holding the tokens is mostly cleared out by now. They've run 3 different airdrops, and what we're going to look at here is some data around those airdrops, just to get a sense for how airdrops work. Kind of nice things to look at here. So this is I think this is the third one. Let's go to the first. Okay, sorry, this is the last. This is one of the airdrop first airdrop season. So the gray is the balance left in the airdrop wallet. At the end, we've cut this off here because the scale is a bit messed up. They clear out the wallet, send them back to, in fact, this address. That's what some of these jump ups are in various transfers here. Send them back to that wallet to recycle for future, you know, unclaimed whatever airdrop contents. So one of the first things to note here, so this orange line here is the number of outflows, right? So this is the number of people who are claiming. So you can see that claims at the beginning and then smaller numbers of claims. But there's still, okay, orange here, and then green is the average outflow amount. So this is interesting because you can see there are thousands. There's 43,000 on the first date here, 16,000 number of claims, right? And then down here, there are much, much, much smaller numbers of claims. But the average size of those claims actually reasonably flat. It goes up at the end, maybe, right? So this is a 4,800 average size on a much smaller number, and this is 40,000 on a 700 whatever average size. So the first thing to note here in the first airdrop season, generically you'd think most people would take it out pretty early, and you'd think the more tokens you had, the earlier you take them out. I was actually expecting the later stuff to all be shrapnel amounts as opposed to much larger average sizes. If we go on and we look at the next airdrop season, you see the same dynamic where most of the claims are at the beginning, but actually the amounts here, does that have any trend to it at all? Just kind of all flat, right? The average amounts are all the same. And you can see here, this well into the process, there are 374 outflows of an average of 194, and back here there were 7,500, so a lot more, but still an average, similar size. So the people who are collecting from this appear to be the size of your position doesn't seem related to when you pull it out, which is interesting. Now, the aggregate amount is clearly declining over time, but it's just as a behavior. You'd think people with bigger deposits would pull first.
Well, it's not the size that matters.
Anyway, but that isn't true. And in fact, the third here, we see a similar dynamic. This is the full balance, and then you can look at, okay, so this is them clearing it's not them clearing. This is the largest individual pull, because this is 25,000 tokens, and you can see the balance at this point is still millions, right? So you can see here that actually the largest individual pool person waited quite a long time. But again, you've got, here, not the first day, it's a few days later, peaks and runs. And it's interesting to me that you can look at this behavior, look at the balance, right? And you can see that people's behaviors are not really as expected. Why is there a resurgence here in September with number of outflows? Because this is hundreds, right? This isn't one guy that forgot. This is hundreds. And here you're only looking at whatever it is, thousands, some 7,500. So, maybe it's people doing partial things. All kinds of different stuff could be going on. But it's, it is interesting. So this here will do. This shows us the amount coming out. So this is, flows out of the, out of the wallet, balance decreasing, whatever, over time, which is, I don't know, it's interesting. It's interesting to see that airdrops don't behave quite the way I would have thought they do. Similarly, and you can tell here this number, whatever's going on here, behavioral wise, these are pretty smooth, natural looking things. We've had this before where we look at data and we're convinced immediately a very smooth line can't be real. It depends on what behavior you're talking about. So we previously looked at cumulative number of addresses that received from a single sender, right? And we concluded because it was very smooth and because the receivers had never been used, that had to be fake. Here, this all looks real, even though it's smooth, right? Because we're seeing, first of all, deviations that are not consistent with completely bot behavior. And we know this isn't up on the screen, but you can identify that the wallets that are receiving these tokens were active doing other things, right? So if you're sending tokens to active wallets and you get this kind of smooth downdraft, everything looks reasonable. Similarly, let's pull the, was it this one that had the nice? Yeah. This does not look like bot behavior on average outflow size, does it? If these were all flat at 500 or whatever it is, you'd be convinced. And we've seen this previously where it's whatever units or round amounts. So this looks like a natural thing because it's smooth when you cut in certain directions and rough when you cut in other directions. Right? You generally conclude stuff is completely fake when it's smooth no matter how you cut it. Right? This really looks like natural behavior. Similarly, that's got to be natural. I mean, this is a guy that forgot, whatever. That these are not smooth curves. The balance is declining roughly how you'd expect. But again, if you try to fit a line to this, it's not perfectly some exponential function, whatever. It just happens to be a smooth looking curve. We've seen stuff that was like properly straight exponential. So just a little bit of aggregate data to look at in one project, some things. And to note that whatever was going on with the smuggled out tokens, it has migrated or resolved itself one way or another. So there you go. Interesting things to look at. This is a new way we're going to be looking at some balances for a while that I think you can find fascinating manipulation. I'll just say while we have this up, imagine if you had a chart like this, but everything was a multiple of 10,000 or 1,000 or 5,000, whatever. They were all even multiples of the same total. That could clearly be suspicious, right? You can identify suspicious behaviors with this type of slicing of data, just maybe different things than you've looked at before. So there you go.
All right. You want to talk about your Impossibility?
Sorry, none of that's about what's happening with EtherFi itself.
Oh,
that's
no,
about,
yeah.
The dynamics of how airdrops actually work as opposed to what people would expect.
Correct. So you want to talk about your compliance impossibility paper? I think, if you could.
A few minutes on this. We've done analogies for this stuff before. So this is work with a couple of other people in a journal called Scientific Reports that we.
No, a couple other people. Professors.
Two other professors, yes. It was me and two other co-authors. We've similarly done work on stablecoin and risk-free interest rate impossibility. So this is a generalization of that. So this, in fact, I think covers within a single framework most, if not all, of the known sort of blockchain permissionless impossibility results that are out there. Depending on how you phrase trustless bridge impossibility, it may or may not cover that. I think that it does, but it covers a lot of other things. David Rosenthal's blog has a nice curated list of various impossibility results that Mike and Ben, the three of us in these papers, we're like 3 of the 14 or something entries on there. We're not the majority of the list. I think this covers most, if not all, of that stuff in a more general framework we finally have put together. So that what we're doing here is we're asking if transparency, the ability to see all the transactions and all the code, is sufficient to build automated compliance into the system, right? Because this is the dream. All right, and the answer is no. And instead of explaining the no, I think it's better off to explain simpler systems in which transparency works, and then go through how transparency falls down. Right. So you start thinking about a very, very simple system that's just seashells or physical money, right? And there's no electronic anything; it's just physical money, right? So everybody's got seashells. And if you want to have regulations like you can't trade with that guy, or you can only transact 5 times a day, maximum balances, payment amounts, whatever, any of that sort of stuff, your compliance problems come down to knowing where the seashells are, right? So whose house are they in? Who has what balances? And collectively, everyone in the economy, everyone on the island, right, has that information, but it's sliced up in different pieces. I know where mine are, you know where yours are, maybe we both know where each other's are, but we don't know where that person's are, whatever it is. And if you put all of those transactions just onto a simple public ledger that shows transfers, approximately that's what Bitcoin is, then you can automate those sorts of compliance rules. Right. Bitcoin has a little bit of a scripting language, so let's ignore that for now. But pretend you have a simple version of Bitcoin where you just send to public key goes to public key, right? That's what the addresses are. In that case, transparency is sufficient, right? And we think, everybody I've discussed this with, you've discussed this with, thinks a lot of the problem here is people have generalized from that environment to one in which you have a very powerfully programmable system that anybody can update. All right, so there's a difference here. In the simple system, knowing everything means seeing all the transactions and seeing all the balances. I can read all the code and there isn't any code, right? It's just a transfer system. So in sort of math terms, this is a system that can do addition and subtraction, paired sets of addition and subtraction. And I can transfer to you, you can transfer to me, but it can't do anything more complicated than that. It doesn't have multiplication, division, square root, whatever. People with more mathematical knowledge will understand things about whatever completeness, compactness, rings, and whatever various types of operators. And this is a very, very, very simple system. It's not really a full algebra, whatever. Doesn't matter. Now, when you talk about a more richly programmable system, what you mean by seeing everything is that you can now read code in some complicated programming language. All right? And the problem here is if you have a system where the code is all fixed at the beginning, right, you could sit down and you could prove properties of that code or not, whatever, and then you'd know what the system's compliance capabilities were. Right? So this is a system that's sort of, this is not Ethereum. This is a system where it's Ethereum, but all the smart contracts are baked in at the beginning. A very, very simple version of the system. And if you wrote your contracts correctly and then wrote the correct proofs, you did the verification that all of those contracts enforced the rules you wanted, you could constructively build a system that was compliant, that built compliance in. You wouldn't necessarily be able to change the rules later, right? But you'd be able to have some kind of set of rules. So that would require relatively simple programs. We'll come to that in a second, because when you start allowing people to upgrade code, you have problems, and this is the crux of the paper. When you have powerful programming languages, automated classification is very difficult. So a classical regulation that people look at is banning transacting with a given guy. It's often North Korea or some terrorist group, whatever it is, OFAC entry. And going back to the DAO hack, what is that, 8 years ago or so now? 9 years ago.
Yeah.
Longer, maybe.
Yeah.
It was recognized that because of what's known as the halting problem, whatever it is, this classification of complex code, you couldn't figure out what addresses a given contract, a given piece of fresh code would interact with in advance. You had to run them. This is what the Avalanche founder and 2 other people wrote up as running a screener for the banned addresses is a DDoS attack vector, essentially, against the system, because you could write programs that you'd have to go and run to figure out where they went, because you can't statically analyze the code. This goes back to 1930s work, whatever it is. So what you've got here, this goes back again to the DAO. We're just generalizing that stuff a little bit. Being omniscient in your simple economy means you can see all the balances, you can see all the transfers, and you know who everybody is. Being omniscient in your programmable economy means you can read all the code, but that doesn't let you answer every question about what that code will do in every scenario. You have to go run the code in that scenario and find out what happens. So you can't preemptively enforce regulation in that environment. The static collection of code, you could prove properties. That's a system in which you can have smart contracts in Ethereum, but not new ones, right? So you see projects where there's an admin key, they deploy a bunch of contracts, the first 100 blocks, 1,000 blocks, first day, whatever, and then they revoke the admin key, nothing's upgradable going forward, right? Now, ignoring the fact that they interact with the rest of the world, which causes its own problems, that kind of a static environment you might be able to prove properties about. But if that static environment accepts input from arbitrary fresh programs, it has no way of saying, is this new program that wants to trade with me a mixer? Right? Because identifying mixers automatically isn't possible. So now we come back here to the crux of things. A regulation like don't transact with X is already known, not automatically enforceable, back to the DAO stuff. And we're generalizing that and saying a regulation like don't interact with a mixer, for any sensible definition of mixer, various other types of classifications, that's also not enforceable, right? So you need to, there are essentially two ways to fix this problem, right? One of them is to limit the amount of change you can make to the system, right? Which we just talked about. So if you have a system in which the code can't be upgraded at all, you can analyze the initial system. Maybe you can prove properties. I mean, maybe you can't. You can design systems that are non-compliant, but you try. It's fixed. In fact, you can allow some limited amount of changes to programs. It needs to be a non-Turing complete update, whatever. The paper has the technical details, but you can allow a limited amount of programmability that would let you make small changes, but would not let you develop novel services. Right. So, for example, if your initial system started up and then somebody thought of Compound or Aave, you wouldn't be able to go write that. You wouldn't be able to add Uniswap to the system. You'd have had to figure it out at the beginning in a specific way, write a compromised compliant version, and that would be your entire system. So it limits the freedom you have to do things. Right. The other thing you can do is you can require all of the updates in the system, arbitrarily powerful, change whatever you want, write your new version of Aave, but they have to pass through some filter, and you trust that filter, a person, a regulator, an off-chain, non-automated process. You email some guy, and the guy publishes your code, right? You can trust somebody. You can have a permissioned system like that, where that person's responsible for enforcing the rules. That raises its own collection of problems, right? The most obvious problem is if that person makes a mistake, they may be able to revoke access going forward, but they can't then enforce against people for transactions sort of that weren't compliant, but they said were compliant in error, right? So you have a weird regulatory dynamic there where if the regulator has to gatekeep, and if it allows it through the gate and made a mistake, it can revoke permission later, but it has to honor that it was allowed through the gate. So in order to use that approach and actually get anywhere with automation, the government has to credibly commit to not prosecute people for exploiting its own mistakes, which, is interesting.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't actually mean that as a joke. I mean that very explicitly, because if you have to submit applications and proofs and engineering diagrams or whatever for the regulator to accept your smart contracts, and it turns out that, forget bad faith, just a mistake was made.
Yeah.
Right. That then needs to be resolved. But the system isn't automated if they can go back and claw back and enforce against people for that error. That's a completely different way of looking at things, I think, that regulators are used to, or that users of financial systems are used to. Right? So I think you're more likely to end up with the very limited update power system where you study it once at the beginning, launch it, and it might work. You can rely on permissions in various ways.
Which is what the financial institutions seem to be leaning towards. If you look at some of the ones, I believe JP Morgan has their own internal blockchain system that's heavily permissioned.
Yeah, if you run a private one where you can just cancel everything and reallocate arbitrarily, then you don't actually... So what I had said before, they have to honor the transactions that went through. If you control the whole system, you can simply reverse historical transactions and you can prevent them from happening. Right?
Yeah.
Whether or not that's automated in a blockchain sense is a philosophical... Right? It's
Correct.
not a philosophy class here. Right? But so we've outlined... The paper outlines in excruciating detail using examples as well, what the sorts of compromises you have to make are, and you have to make some compromises or your system will be exploitable. We also provide instructions for how to exploit systems that don't make appropriate compromises. It's not made extremely explicit because advertising here instructions for using mixers in a way that's undetectable may not be ideal from a variety of perspectives, but
it's good business if you can get it.
I think anybody that's got a meaningful amount of sort of software engineering and theoretical computer science background will read the paper and figure that out pretty quickly. This is not like a deep hidden result. It's pretty obvious how
it's not a cookbook as well.
Yeah. Well, no, it is not. We don't give a variety of sort of complex practical schemes, but once you see what the limit is, it's immediately obvious what the end running strategy is. They are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
So that is definitely in there, and it's interesting for people to think about that. I think a lot of people would benefit from thinking about not how to make their system more compliant, but how to attack a proposed compliance scheme for their system, because it'll make it easier for them to understand the flaws in the proposal. Because when you can come up with a way to trivially evade the regulations in 20 minutes, it's not a very good regime.
Check out the paper.
Yeah, it gives a good framework for doing that. You can attack. There's a lot of proposals. We have links to and references to some of these things. You can find stuff as well in our tweets and whatnot of people who've proposed, there are solutions. Like, well, in some cases, the set of solutions is empty. In some cases, the set of solutions have properties that you don't want.
So check out the paper.
Yeah,
we have it here. It's on Nature's Scientific Reports. There you can
Well,
go
there's a
up
link
there.
in there. You'll find it.
And we'll leave a link in the comments, so you should check it out. It's quite accessible even if you're not technically inclined. All right, let's moving on. Brian Armstrong is talked about how I think he would be open to delisting Tether if he was so asked, and also
Which is interesting, right? I'm a licensed exchange provider, and if I'm asked by the government to stop doing so, like, yes, of course you will. You gonna anyway.
yeah, like the guy with the gun or the taser says get your hands off this guy. Generally, most people tend to comply.
Well, I
Otherwise,
meant
they
more
get shot.
generically. I run a pharmacy, and the government tells me to stop selling heroin, and I do. But anyway, it's both of those are things you should do.
Yeah. So and then he talks about T-bill backing. Come on. What do you think of this?
Yeah, okay. So the Armstrong comments about how they would be, willing to delist Tether if the government told them to.
Okay.
And that's not a surprise at all. And that he thinks that stablecoin regulation, because there's all this talk about upcoming Trump, whatever, stablecoin regulation, will require T-bill backing.
Okay.
And then at the same time, Circle, which is, we call that an affiliate or a sister company or whatever, vaguely related to Coinbase. They have some cross-investment, whatever.
Yeah.
Bought a Hashnote, which runs the USYC on-chain T-bill fund, whitelist, whatever fund. So presumably USDC and USYC will now have some stuff together, good name pairs. Both of these are sort of showing us that these folks, that part of whatever crypto stuff, think that using T-bills is going to be the way forward for stablecoins. Armstrong said explicitly he thinks it'll be the required way. It generates yield, so it solves some of the yield problems and the rest of it. Fair enough. So I think it's interesting now to consider the full life cycle here over, was it 13 years since Mastercoin was first proposed? Mastercoin was the first attempt at proposing a dollar-pegged stablecoin that wasn't backed by dollars directly. People started off with, well, can we just do this Bitcoin style and get the price to stay at 1? And people struggled to figure that out. Spoiler alert, they couldn't, but they didn't know that at the time. They just figured it out. The Tether folks came in pretty early on, and even in their own documentation said, we don't think there is a way to do this without just having a pile of dollars, so we're going to have a pile of dollars. Right? And that led them, whatever's going on with Tether, the narrative we're going to give here is just an objective, historical, whatever. That led them to moving around the world and from bank to bank for a long time, and maybe still announced the moves to El Salvador recently. Right? They were in Taiwan, they were in Hong Kong, they had various parts of the Caribbean. Their banking was in the U.S. It's moved all over the place. It was in some personal bank account in Canada, whatever. So they had difficulty implementing let's just use dollars in a bank account to run this thing strategy. Doesn't matter what the reasons were. They had difficulties. And that was hard, right? You're not getting much interest. Random bank accounts and people's names for companies and obscure banks in jurisdictions that aren't really, great jurisdictions for banking may not pay you much interest, and it may be hard for you to distribute it routinely to people if your banking is compromised. If you're lying to the bank about the identity of the owner, you're not going to want to make constant deposits and withdrawals because you're going to freeze your account, right? So paying interest is hard. That's just mechanically true. And then we've seen people start to use T-bills and get some interest and whatnot in the last couple of years. And what both Brian Armstrong's comments and Circle's actions here indicate is these guys are sort of accepting that the only way they can do this is to have direct government liability backing, right? So T-bills are direct liabilities of the U.S. government. And I find that interesting because at that point, when your backing is direct central government, large government, whatever liabilities, they're sort of entitled to ask you who your liabilities are to, right? There are a lot of issues around UBO identification for these things. Different parts of the world, whether interest is paid or not paid, whatever, might make a difference. But if you're talking about generically interest-bearing central government liabilities held book entry at the central bank, that last bit means is that in almost all cases, in almost all countries, all the government bonds are all held within the central bank, which just maintains a database of who owns them. And so they can do whatever they want with them at any time. Also, you'd think the central bank would do whatever the central government said with respect to its own bonds.
Presumably.
They have a lot of leverage there. And reporting requirements for UBOs and the rest of it. So a lot of this has sort of gone in a big circle for over a decade of trying to find a way to run these things, get interest, get free from controls payments, and escape whatever central government control. And everybody's tried everything they can come up with and have come back to the beginning with, well, let's just leave the money in a government money market fund and process it from there. And that may be a bit too on the nose, right? I think the government then has, well, you had no other ideas? You're just running something that's backed by a money market fund? Why would we treat this any differently than any other SPV that held money market fund shares? Because SPVs holding money market fund shares
are subject to UBO.
There's an entire book written around the U.S. Treasury strips market called, I think it's actually called Black and White on Wall Street, and has a whole racial element that's nothing to do with finance. But the guy was doing strips trading in stuff that was Caribbean SPVs holding parts of Treasury bonds and making payments all over the place. It's an interesting book. Whatever. The point there simply is this is not new at all. Mm-hmm. You're going to be running T-bill holding SPVs and transferring SPV certificates around. Lots of finance has done that for a very, very long time, and the rules ain't going to be any different for you.
But it's on the blockchain.
Yeah, well, as we just discussed, you're going to need to have someone accountable for compliance-type decisions if you're going to insist on permissionless transfers and rich programmability. And, in the case of Circle, and Hashnote has onboarded some products that interact with relatively rich programmability and no permissions. So there's a conflict brewing there. If Brian Armstrong's plan is to just end up running a bunch of stablecoins on an exchange that are backed by money market fund things, they're just talking about running the stablecoin side of the system then is just a broker. You trade an interactive brokers, your collateral can be money market fund shares. It's fine. When you post, if you're individuals aren't, but if you're directly a member of the CME, whatever type exchange, you don't actually have to post them cash. You can post them government bonds. They just pay interest. It's all fine. Or they'll pay SOFR on your cash deposits, whatever. So they're just recreating that exactly with the same degree of central government control.
Bitcoin fixes this.
Well, yeah, I think what we've discovered is that if you want to have the fix, such as it is, you're going to have to let go of one of these pillars. So, in fact, one of the examples we give in the compliance paper concerns Terra Luna. You can think of Terra Luna. People don't normally do this, but you can think of this as a compliance problem, right? So the statement, do not interact with mixers, is as much a compliance statement as this token that I made up will always be worth $1 because of my dynamic trading algorithm, right? Or I will prevent interacting with sanctioned addresses through my dynamic update process. Those are qualitatively the same kind of a thing. And of course, you can't do that automatically, right? So what they have to do is put in a firm tether. They did a great job naming that product to the thing they want it anchored to. They did a bad job naming that product. Right? And you're seeing that. You're seeing that in practice, right? But when they put this connection in, the properties of the one system are now connected to the properties of the other system. So you've given up the censorship resistance because you've now directly signed on the dotted line, probably literally for the SPV, that the interest-bearing government liabilities, your assets, their liabilities, that are backing your system, well, they can just be frozen at will by the issuer if they're not satisfied with your disclosures around the UBOs.
Which is a real thing.
Yeah.
Or if, it eventually gets found out.
There's no more 4 levels of indirection, and this bank's doing that, and this bank's doing that.
Yeah, if it eventually gets found out that some of the holders of the tokens that are backed by things like USYC and stuff like that turn out to be not so nice people, or now that the drug cartels are a terrorist organization, if that sort of stuff
I don't know how that impacts some of the.
if some of that stuff gets found out, then not going to work out so well for you.
Because the OFACing generally there was done with international, where the government's claim was they were related to some large multinational criminal, whatever.
Yeah.
But if they're just going to call, I don't want to too deep in this, but if you're just going to start calling people who are only drug cartels in North America on the same list as international terrorist state actor stuff, then maybe you would step up the OFACing. I don't think they OFAC. Well, I guess if the drug dealers are in the U.S. and they're American, they can't be OFAC. But yeah, I didn't even realize that may change the game. as well.
And if it turns out that a lot of these um, drug cartels also like that yield, because it's tough, for a cartel member to open an interactive broker's account.
This is talked about. There's even scenes in Narcos where they talk about how they don't earn any interest on the dollars because they're on a pile.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Which is,
I mean, it's a weird thing to think about, but it's a thing.
it's not going to end well, is all I'm saying.
No, there was. I mean, Tether running around offshore, and then the people that paid yield being weird other schemes did make a lot of this much more of a complex game of cat and mouse. When the stablecoin issuer directly says, I'm just going to have a count at Boney, it's just going to hold a bunch of T-bills, and I'm going to issue a bunch of tokens against it, the government presumably, and then you're going to have the ability to freeze those tokens, the government can then just come to you and say, freeze this address with this amount. I don't even have to give you a reason because I'm, whatever. The court, once the paper is stamped, there's no longer, you have to have a conversation about the reason at some point. And then freeze the assets, job done. There's no more circuitous route. Like, how do you email Tether? You hope for the best. Anyway. It's a bit complex. And yeah, USYC wrapped in several layers of things. As you remove this indirection and obfuscation, enforcement gets clearer and clearer. You can't argue the government doesn't understand when a listed U.S. company is the issuer and the processor of the payments.
Well, on that happy note, thanks for tuning in.
It's a depressed that decentralization may not be in the upswing, even if the regulatory environment is blooming.
Yeah, be careful, what you wish for. You just might get it.
That's the one.
Yeah. So on that happy note, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for all your likes, comments, and subscribes. We appreciate it. So does the algorithm, so that helps us to get out to more viewers and get this content out there. Otherwise, have a great weekend. We will see you again next week. Till then, bye-bye.
Yep.